Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU Audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, Staff Training and Research Institute of Distance Education, STRIDE, Master's Degree Programs, Master of Arts, Distance Education, MADE, First Year. MDE 411 Growth and Philosophy of Distance Education. Block 5 Growth and Innovations. Unit 6, Distance Education in Developing Countries, Prospects and Challenges. P.R. Ramanujam, 1997. Editor's note: this paper by P.R. Ramanujam was first presented at the 18th World Conference of the International Council for Distance Education, ICDE, at Penn State University, USA, in June 1997. Ramanujam raises a number of issues related to the practice of distance education, more particularly of adopting and adapting the relevant models for developing countries. The issues raised and arguments advanced here may generate a wider debate on the theories and practices of distance education which are increasingly subjected to scrutiny all over the world. We expect this paper to be of interest to not only the distance learners but also the practitioners and theoreticians of distance education. A global view. The phenomenal growth of distance and open learning systems all over the world has drastically changed the educational scenario everywhere today. The conventional notions about teaching learning are being replaced very fast by new ideas and strategies, thanks to the revolutionary changes continuously taking place in the media and communication. Since the concept of education as investment is also steadily gaining ground, even the poorest countries are slowly turning their attention to the educational needs of their respective populations in order to survive and develop. Distance education has been viewed by many as a viable strategy to achieve the national educational goals quickly and at low costs. At present, there are 17 distance and open learning institutions of different types and sizes located in 107 countries. The number of distance learners is approximately 50 million at the higher education level, which is expected to reach 90 million by 2000 AD and 120 million by 2025 AD, Dhanrajan 1996, as per the available recorded data pertaining mostly to institutions funded and or recognized by the governments and the public bodies. If we add to these the private and unregistered institutions and the students learning through them, the figures will be still higher. In India alone, as per the latest data available in 1995, there were about 57 distance teaching units called correspondence, distance education departments located within conventional universities. 7 state open universities and 1 national open university, AIU Handbook 1995. Over 1 million students would be on the rolls of these institutions in 1999, and the number of state open universities would have gone up. At the school level, the National Open School offers education to about 60,000 students spread across the country, Chakrabarti K. 1994. Besides these, distance teaching programs are offered by some private institutions and television companies, e.g. Z programs by Zee TV. The management programs offered by Jan TV, Sun TV and others. Roughly about 16% of the student population at the higher education level is already taken care of by the correspondence, distance, open learning systems. The expansion of the distance and open learning system in other countries, both developed and developing, has established beyond any doubt the fact that this system is going to play a very important role in the 21st century. The present dominance of campus-based higher education may become a thing of the past perhaps by the middle of the next century. If not earlier than that. Possibly the merger of the two systems may take place faster than expected, and it may lead to new structures of educational institutions and new strategies which may be used by both campus-based and distance mode institutions. If that is the trend, then, what will be the implications of it for the developing countries? The implications could be many, but the most important of them will be for the economy, sovereignty and the culture of the people of the developing world. How the growth of distance and open learning will impact the areas seemingly unrelated to education in the developing nations can be accounted for by analyzing the nature of demands made by the system on the resources of a country, the curriculum, methodology and the managerial process as a whole. Besides these, the cost factor, which is usually assumed to be cheaper in the distance education system, plays a major role in promoting the system in place of face-to-face campus-based education. Distance education in the developed world. Distance education scenario in the developed world presents a comparatively bright and promising picture for the 21st century. The Open University, UK for example, has become the country's largest university, which now plays a central role in the credit transfer and award validation mechanisms that knit British higher education and training together. John Daniel, 1995. In general, the European Distance Education Network, EDEN, shows that the European countries have firmly recognized the distance and open learning system as part of their educational enterprise. North America, Australia and Japan have developed their own distance teaching learning systems in many forms flexible enough to cater to the varied needs of their different learner clientele. Seward, 1995. Advancement in communication devices which are widely used by the distance and open learning institutions in the developed countries make the individualized teaching learning possible there. Besides, the well-established academic traditions and a wider provision for basic primary and secondary education have created a strong base for extending higher vocational and unconventional educational programs to those segments of adult populations who have limited or no access to campus-based face-to-face education in the different areas at the tertiary level. A brief overview of the prominent features of distance and open learning scenario in some of the advanced countries would give us a better understanding of the situation in those countries. For example, in the United Kingdom, Germany, France, Norway, Sweden, Spain, the United States of America, Canada, Japan and Australia, the distance, open learning systems operate very effectively for the following reasons. Adult learners with an appreciable degree of basic, primary, secondary education. Medium of instruction is mostly through the mother tongue of the learner. Technology and communication facilities. Availability and accessibility of well-equipped, advanced institutions with clear vision and mission statements. Adequate resource mobilization. Thoughtful and committed academic leadership. Flexible and need-based curriculum. Committed and/or trained, qualified staff. Thorough planning and implementation of educational programs. Adequate and efficient student support services. Continuous and systematic monitoring, review and evaluation, and political will, which is crucial, to back up the projects and institutions. Historically, the advanced countries in the West and also Japan had developed a very good network of communication systems. In the 19th century, locomotives, road transport, steam navigation, telegraphs and telephones speeded up the process of transportation and communication in Europe. The Industrial Revolution made it necessary for the nations to improve transport to carry out their economic, trading, commercial and military activities successfully. As a byproduct of these, experiments with new ways of teaching learning started, though slowly and on a limited scale. Humanistic education was still struggling against the centuries-old sectarian religious dogmas in the 19th century when the campus-based classroom teaching was emerging as the dominant mode. Isaac Pitman, in a way, planted the seed of the modern correspondence education when he started offering postal tuition on shorthand in 1840 in Britain. Pitman would not have imagined that after a century his small educational venture would grow into a significant mode of education spread in many forms in the United States of America, Australia, Western Europe and Canada in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Since campus-based, classroom teaching was confined to the upper classes and the middle classes in the industrialized nations, the forceful demand for education from the working classes and other deprived sections of the society had to be met through some means. After the Second World War, the demand was felt all the more urgently because the issue had a potential to disturb, if not overthrow, the existing social order, and the ruling classes could ill afford such an eventuality that would lead to social unrest. The concept of the welfare state was gaining importance, presumably with the approval of the ruling classes. Throughout Western Europe, in order to contain the spread of social revolutions which had already covered one-third of the globe in the late 1940s. As a part of the welfare state concept, new ways of meeting the increasing educational demands of the people were also to be sought. At the higher educational level, the Open University system became the flagship to meet the challenge. The history of the establishment of the Open University in the United Kingdom in 1969 makes it abundantly clear that the Labour government's policy to expand higher education through the Open University was the least revolutionary in the classical sense of the phrase. Nevertheless, the project had to be pushed through with skill and determination because of the perceived social threat in it by the Conservatives, Perry 1976. It is a different matter that later on, the Thatcherite conservatives too found it useful to ward off dangers from the lower classes demanding more of their share in the educational domain. The Open University is an example of how harmless palliative can be projected as a revolutionary measure by the left of the center politicians, which in turn would be perceived as a threat and therefore opposed by the die-hard conservatives. Neither of the stances did substantially alter the role of open universities and distance education, as is evidenced by the experience of many countries in the advanced world. Educational concerns of the developing world. An analysis of the socio-cultural contexts in which the terms distance and open education were originally coined and used would show that the advanced Western countries conceived distance education concepts on the basis of their technological growth, cultural heritage, and academic traditions. Not that there are no conflicts among the educational philosophies of Western countries with regard to distance education. The ongoing debates in the developed world on the sociological and pedagogic implications of technology-based teaching learning, the philosophical principles which shape the distance learning curricula, the ideological biases in course contents, the cost factor, marketability to educational enterprises, and other issues have much relevance of distance education in the developing world. However, the level of the debates as such shows that the concerns of distance educators in the developing countries are more at the basic level. The concerns are such as the following. I. Can some sort of education reach the people? E. Can the shrinking educational budgets meet the minimum infrastructural requirements? E. Will there be an appreciable degree of success in the course completion rates? IV. Are there job opportunities for those who complete their studies through distance mode? V. Are there enough arrangements to provide education to those who want it, irrespective of its use value? These and similar issues dominate the thinking of the policy makers and administrators in the developing countries. Surveying the distance education scenario in a number of developing countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, Manjulika and Reddy, 1996, observed the following common features: inadequate finances, poor communicational and infrastructural facilities, absence of clear governmental policies, limited use of audiovisual media, shortage of experts to develop multimedia courses, lack of financial and academic autonomy for distance teaching institutions, low social and academic status of distance education because of quality issues. Individual studies on the specific problems of developing countries have been studied by a number of researchers, see Arger 1990, Holmberg 1989, Peter Smith et al. 1987. However, the conclusions and generalizations which are to be derived from the specific contexts are very significant for this discussion. What appears to be quite obvious from the point of view of academic research becomes important when looked at from the political, cultural, and sociological angles of the current distance education scenario. Some research studies have posed the questions related to distance education in the developing countries frankly and directly, Arger 1993, Villaroel 1995, Oliveira and Rumble 1991. Others have given a descriptive analysis of the needs, issues, possibilities, challenges, etc., of the developing countries practicing distance education. But the descriptive details in themselves are significant. The overall aims of distance education curricula, the characteristic features of the students' clientele, the infrastructural facilities such as buildings, electricity, postal services, transport, telecommunications, the television, radio network, etc., and the human resources to use the facilities, especially the media technology when made available, are the key factors which must engage the attention of distance educators in the developing world. These factors have utmost significance in the context of proposing distance education as the viable alternative strategy to tackle the educational problems at the national levels in many developing countries. But what does actually happen in the developing world? The Open University and the developing world. The success of the British Open University in the 70s obviously acted as the inspiration for policymakers in many developing countries to establish their own open universities or distance teaching units. In India, for example, the thinking of establishing an open university at the national level had been there for a decade before it actually materialized in 1985 with the establishment of Indira Gandhi National Open University, IGNOU, Parthasarthi Committee Report 1974. Although the Andhra Pradesh Open University, now Dr. B. R. Ambedkar Open University, was established in 1982, the blueprint prepared for a full-fledged open university was given some kind of practical shape only in the establishment of IGNOU, which is broadly modeled after the Open University. UK. In 1974, i.e., 5 years after the OUUK came into existence, Pakistan established the Allama Iqbal Open University, AIOU, at Islamabad. The AIOU has been guided by the consultants from the UK from its inception. Thailand established its two major open universities, Sukhothai Thammathirat Open University, STOU, and Ramkhamhaeng University, RU, in 1978 and 1971 respectively. Although Thailand too got the inspiration from the success story of the OUUK, it has deviated a lot in adapting the open university system to suit its local needs. Sri Lanka, 1981, Bangladesh, 1988, Malaysia, 1980, Hong Kong, 1990, Singapore, 1991, and South Korea, 1983, are some of other important examples of countries having drawn inspiration from the British Open University. However, the British Open University itself was the result of Harold Wilson's inspiration that he got from the former USSR when he visited it in 1956 and saw the tremendous success of distance education of a different sort, which was centrally planned and implemented by the Soviet state to meet the educational demands of the country. The East European countries, the former German Democratic Republic, Cuba, Nicaragua, Zimbabwe and Tanzania are other notable examples which have modeled their educational policies and practices on the basis of the experience of the USSR. In the post-Mao People's Republic of China, distance education got an impetus through radio and television broadcasting. Central Radio and Television University, CRTVU, 1978, is one of the biggest institutions in the world which provide education to workers who need to update their technical and vocational skills. Distinction or the divide? What really distinguishes the distance education of the developed countries from that of the developing world is the overall aim set for it. In the developed countries, the broad aim is to provide education to individuals who need it at different levels with different individual needs. In the developing countries, the aim becomes a collective one, such as nation building, eradication of illiteracy, rural development, health education, women's education, tribal education, education of the socially disadvantaged, etc., besides the usual academic, technical and vocational programs. The very magnitude of the aims, goals set before distance education in the developing countries makes the educational operations very complex and demanding. The potential of distance education is stretched too far to meet every educational need which has not been met so far. This has put tremendous pressure on the systems of distance education which are yet to take firm roots. In one way, distance education is perceived as the solution for all the shortcomings of conventional, face-to-face education in the developing countries. In another way, it is projected as the cost-effective, and therefore a cheap way of meeting the demands of education. In the process, too little money is allocated to meet too many educational needs. As a matter of fact, much of the educational crises in the developing world can be traced to the same economic arguments. Because the educational budgets in these countries have been usually small, the standard and the quality of education too have not been high. The spread of literacy and the expansion of education at different levels have suffered precisely because of the meager allocation made to all the educational projects. This fact is usually ignored by those who criticize the face-to-face education and attribute every educational fiasco to it. If the funding of education is rationalized on a scientific basis, perhaps distance education could meet the demands much faster and more efficiently than the lumberous, rigid and expensive structures of campus-based education. In spite of all the possible hurdles, distance education has been spreading rapidly. There is no reason to believe that the hurdles cannot be overcome. What is really needed is a systematic appraisal of the impact of distance education in the developing countries over the decades to find out the strengths and the weaknesses for the systems as obtaining in many countries. The weaknesses, once identified, would persuade the practitioners to go for remedial measures. If remedial measures are not taken consciously with sufficient political will, then there is every possibility of turning the system into a self-serving agent which may serve the interest of a few individuals, but the system as such will not achieve the intended goals of nations and peoples. Lack of resources, African scenario. Paucity of material and human resources has in general affected the practice of distance education in every developing country that has not been able to achieve its educational goals. Here I will present a typical case. Ethiopia started its distance education project in the early 1960s. But it did not have either the necessary infrastructural facilities or the expertise in designing, developing and implementing its educational program. During 1962 to 64, the Distance Education Division, DER, invited an American dean of the Extension Division of Nebraska University as a consultant to help design the courses to serve the needs of Ethiopia. The American, while doing the needful for Ethiopians, actually imported the secondary level courses from Nebraska, the USA. As one could expect, the courses did not meet the requirements of the students of Ethiopia. After evaluating this unrewarding exercise, the American dean and local experts tried to develop courses which would suit the local needs. However, after exploring the possibilities of developing the local need-based courses, the attempt, along with the idea, was given up because of lack of resources and expertise in distance education. Enquire S. 1992, although 2 staff members of DER had been sent to the National Extension College, NEC, and the International Extension College, IEC, London, to get the necessary training to develop the relevant courses in Ethiopia, on their return the staff members did not make use of their training of whatever kind, because the university which arranged for their training did not encourage them. As a result, Ethiopia has not been able to make any headway in establishing a distance education system. Nor had it succeeded in creating a good department of distance education either. The Distance Education Division, DER, of Ethiopia is presently passing through a period of doldrums which seems to be the result of long neglect, underfinancing, and understaffing, besides suffering from lack of good leadership. Enquire S. 1992. Ethiopia is an extreme example, but the features of the Ethiopian case are generalizable to describe the situation in many a developing country which does not have the necessary resources and a reasonable degree of expertise. Kenya, one of the richest countries in Africa, has not been able to articulate its educational needs with a future perspective. As a result, it had not made available sufficient funds and human resources to create a relevant, indigenous model of its own to serve the needs of Kenyan students who otherwise cannot have access to face-to-face education. In the absence of strong governmental efforts to meet the demands in this area, private and foreign agencies readily step in to take advantage of the opportunities. And that is exactly what has happened in Kenya too. For many years, private, mainly British correspondence colleges have offered distance education courses to health workers and school teachers in Kenya. Holmberg, 1990. When efforts were made by the state, distance education in Kenya looked up to the future, although a number of factors related to resource mobilization hamper the development of the system at the national level. Limited electricity supply, poor postal services, expensive equipments used by untrained staff in non-professional way, and a large body of untrained teachers create problems for a healthy and faster development of the system. Although competent academics are available in Kenya, their number appears to be comparatively small, and the distribution of this small number of competent people across the distance teaching units may not lead to effective utilization of their talents because of the generally unprofessional environment which, of course, is not a unique privilege of Kenya alone. Added to these, is the problem of language as a medium of instruction. Although English is one of the 2 official languages of Kenya playing a dominant role in administration, education, journalism and business, the mastery of English by a majority of Kenyan teachers is regrettably low. Poor mastery of English, which is the medium of instruction, slow administrative process and lack of resources inevitably slow down the speed of distance education in Kenya, a country rich in its oil and natural resources, unlike Ethiopia. Zambia has made tremendous advancement in distance education in recent years. However, inadequate material and human resources negatively affect the quality of the programs as well as the learning process. While acknowledging the achievements of distance education in Zambia, Mulenga, 1987, identified some difficulties, particularly in course development and student services, which reduced the quality of the distance education offering. Zambia, though a small country as compared to Kenya, Ethiopia and India, can however boast of greater success in its endeavor to promote distance education because of its rational resource allocation, concern for quality and care for setting achievable goals and proper planning. In general, distance education in African countries suffers from the same malnutrition that impoverishes educational institutions in other developing countries: shortage of resources. Analyzing the trends in teacher education in the Third World, Gary Coldwell and Som Naidu, 1989, identify population growth and the shrinking resources for primary education as two of the other important reasons for the poor quality of education, including non-availability of trained teachers, particularly in the rural areas where the majority people reside, which make the practical operations difficult and complex. The perennial contradiction in implementing the educational programs in the developing countries, thus, is that of greater needs of education at every level and the grossly inadequate resources to meet them. Latin America. Latin America had been struggling at least for 2 decades till the mid-80s to come to grips with its own problems with respect to deciding on the suitable models of distance education. Rumble, 1985, observed the peculiarities of the Latin American situation in the early 80s and noticed doubts being raised by the Latin American educators about the suitability of the British Open University model in the severely underfunded, poverty-stricken and illiterate nations usually governed by authoritarian regimes. The most significant problems adversely affecting the Latin American distance education have been shortage of resources to create infrastructural facilities, shortage of trained educational managers to plan and operate a distance education system, and the highly politicized nature of university structures which make innovative educational projects very fragile. Although doubts were expressed about the future of distance education even in the 80s, the concept has taken firm roots and in certain respects it has contributed significantly as a model to the developing world, which we shall discuss later. Theses on distance education for the developing world. After having considered some significant experiences of the practice of distance education in the developing world, one could advance the following theses which may draw the attention of distance educators. 1. There are greater perils and dangers involved in blindly copying any Western models of distance education than in evolving indigenous models for the developing countries, even if the latter meant absence of theory and experience. 2. Indigenous models, though very difficult to evolve quickly, once created will have greater relevance and strength than be copied or adopted models. 3. It is possible to create a variety of models which will be equally effective in different specific socio-economic and cultural contexts, irrespective of success models recommended by the experienced distance educators. 4. The future of distance education in the developing countries would depend more on the ability of distance teaching institutions to respond to the specific needs of learners at different levels and less on their resourcefulness to catch up with their counterparts in the developed world. Let me substantiate the above with some evidence. Asian experience. Indonesia offers another classic example of a developing country which got inspiration from the successful Western models of distance education, but in the practice of distance education got trapped because of blind adaptation of success models. Indonesia has its strong traditions of teaching learning, which resemble any other Asiatic academic tradition of respecting the teacher and expecting from him knowledge and wisdom to flow. Besides this reverential treatment of teachers in teaching, the low literacy rate and strong oral traditions do not adequately prepare the teachers as well as the learners to benefit from distance education as practiced in the West. The first obvious mistake that every developing country, including Indonesia, makes is to ignore the ground reality where too many incomparable variables distract the smooth functioning of a model which might have been a success in a developed country. In the context of distance education, the concept and strategies of self-learning have to be applied cautiously and imaginatively. Without the psychological and cultural preparedness of both the teachers and the learners, distance teaching and self-learning will not be successful. The necessary preparedness does not come to them without changing their social, economic and cultural orientation to the extent necessary to receive the concept and adapt it to suit their own conditions. Radon Dunbar, 1991, while addressing some of the above-mentioned issues in Indonesia, observes that the fundamental cause of distance education failure in Indonesia has been the adoption of Western models, without adaptation to suit the acculturized behaviors of Indonesian teachers and learners. Indonesia has a large population, strong Islamic culture, oral traditions of teaching which hold the teachers with high respect and view learners as receivers of knowledge. It has high population growth rate, low literacy rate, limited access to sophisticated technology and a fragile democratic polity. Obviously, it cannot be expected to succeed in practicing distance education in the way it is done in Europe or North America. Nor can it increase its educational budget to the extent necessary to provide resources for face-to-face education to meet the educational needs of the people entirely. The possible alternative would be the creative adaptation of some successful model of distance education. But Indonesia went for adoption rather than adaptation when it established its Open University in 1984, the Universitas Terbuka, UT. The obvious choice of a model for UT was the UK Open University. Naturally, the UT's strategies to impart distance education were based on the strategies of UKOU. UT started its activities with a big bang, admitting 60,000 students for its courses in 1984. And in 1990 about 270,000 students enrolled for the various courses of UT. But the success rate of course completion was anything but satisfactory. The university was beset with all kinds of problems and difficulties in carrying out its plan, particularly in the crucial areas of course development and course delivery. The reasons for the unrewarding exercise are not far to seek. Dunbar, 1991. Any developing country going in for adopting a foreign, especially a Western success model is bound to find itself in a tricky and difficult situation if it fails to adapt the model to suit its own specific situation and plan its activities with a strong sense of realism. Because of uncritical enthusiasm, the planners of distance education in the developing world want to do things in their respective countries in the way the Western institutions have done and succeeded, forgetting the latter's specific concerns, resources, experience and traditions. This uncritical enthusiasm of the planners of the developing world may have three sources. A genuine lack of understanding about the implications of adopting Western models. A desire to please the political bosses by doing something visible for political and publicity purposes and/or the vested interests of some key players who deliberately do things which would suit their personal interest rather than the interests of the institution and the learners. One or all the above can be seen operating behind the planning and execution of distance education projects in the developing countries. Indonesia too must have had its share of this sad experience. The planners of UT indeed heavily depended on the Western models and the Western consultants from the UK, Canada and America. UT's experience in adopting the UKOU strategies in course development and course delivery, though sadly disappointing, has a few valuable lessons to offer to the developing countries which would like to start their own distance teaching. Commenting on the failure of the strategies adopted by the UT for its course development and delivery, Dunbar, 1991, says, "The assumption appears to have been that Indonesian distance teachers and learners would behave in much the same way as their Western counterparts when faced with teaching and learning via mediation, must eventually be mastering the technique of education without a direct and continuous personal relationship with the teacher." The assumption was obviously proved wrong. Because of the fundamental variation in culture of teaching learning between the country which created the model and the country which adopted it. Besides the cultural implications, one could easily discern the other possible reasons: variations in the infrastructure facility, access to technology and provision for a strong student support service. A team of evaluators from UNESCO ICDE studied the myriad problems faced by the UIT in 1990, summarizing the situation at the UT. The report by the UNESCO ICDE team says, UT would appear to be beset by a daunting number of problems of a fundamental nature that will require some dramatic, if not traumatic, changes to be made before it can be accepted by the community as a viable alternative to traditional forms of education. The education philosophy and the current organizational arrangements that have been designed to support it are clearly not working. Similar discoveries will be made sooner or later about the non-working models and strategies adopted by many other developing countries, including India. The most important lesson from these experiences for the developing world is that the blind copying of any successful Western model of distance education would not work in the developing world but, which is much more alarming, would discredit the way philosophy of distance education in the situations dominated by traditional notions of education, and thus hamper its growth for a long time to come. Strengths of indigenous models. As a refreshing contrast to the experience of Indonesia and some other developing countries, the Latin American experience is one of self-confidence and independent thinking. Although many Latin American experiments with distance education had to meet with disappointing experiences and failures, even the grim determination with which some of the Latin American distance teaching institutions have struggled to establish themselves as relevant models in their own right and in their own soil must inspire other parts of the developing world in a positive way. It took about 10 to 15 years for some leading institutions in Latin America to make their presence felt, but the efforts were worth making. Oliveira and Rumble, 1991, in their review of distance education in Latin America recognize a number of strengths and also point out the weaknesses and constraints of the system of distance education. The major strength of distance education in Latin America is to be seen in that it has developed its own forms of distance education to confront realities and problems which are peculiar to the region. Oliveira and Rumble, 1991. The indigenous forms of distance education, school equivalency programs, post-secondary in-service teacher education, university extension education, mass higher education, rural community education, and many developmental programs through distance teaching. The progress in these areas had, of course, been made, despite stiff resistance from the conservative circle of academics and policy makers, as also the problems can used by paucity of resources, experience etc., which lead to the collapse of a number of programs and projects. But the success of indigenous models outshines the failures precisely because of the Latin American determination to find its own solutions to its problems and resist the temptation to imitate the European and North American models blindly. In other words, in spite of hardships and some failures, Latin American region has succeeded in creating the suitable forms of distance education through experiment and adaptation rather than adoption of successful models alien to its own reality. This creativity and adaptation can be observed in a number of aspects of the system, including the use of pedagogy and technology. Oliveira and Rumble observe, the successful transfer of the concept rested in part on the use of communications technologies which already existed in the region and in part on the decision by the planners to adopt an essentially conservative approach to academic policy. In marked contrast to the British model. In general, the regional development of distance education at the higher education level have been a product of the Latin American situation and not of externally imported technologies, policies and structures. No wonder, the Latin American region has been able to show to the world such successful institutions as UNA of Venezuela and UNED of Costa Rica. The mass education programs organized for the poor peasants by Paulo Freire in Colombia has inspired a number of other countries in the region. The potential of radio had been particularly appreciated by the Latin American institutions in Colombia, Brazil and Nicaragua. Nicaragua's mass educational campaigns in 1979 and the early 1980s soon after the Sandinista revolution were remarkable successes. Cuba has been using distance education as an ideal complement to its face-to-face education system since 1978. From among the Asian countries, one could cite Thailand and China as two worthy examples of self-confidence and independent approach in practicing distance education in the forms and ways suitable to their respective situations. From the above survey and analysis of the current practices of distance education in many parts of the world, it should be possible to draw certain conclusions which would have some lessons for the developing countries. Distance education will emerge as a major system in the developing world too in the years to come. The present practice of adopting the Western models will not work in the developing world because of incompatible cultural variations and technological gaps. Any attempt to transplant Western models in the developing countries will hamper the growth of the system by making it permanently dependent on Western experts. Technology and teaching learning strategies. There is an urgency to rethink about the current strategies of course development and delivery in all the countries which, for some reason or other, have based their strategies on the Western, particularly the British model. The use of technology needs to be decided on the basis of its access to institutions and learners in the developing countries. It is not always necessary to have sophisticated technology to establish successful distance education models in the developing countries. Instead of competing with the Western models which need heavy investment and high technology, the developing countries should make use of their available resources to meet their specific educational demands. To make use of the available resources, the developing countries must develop self-confidence and acquire the ability to think independently when they plan and execute their distance education programs. In order to acquire self-confidence and independent thinking, distance educators and policymakers must first study the history of distance education in the advanced countries and relate it to the social and Political history of the relevant countries. The fixation about the successful Western models and the obsession about the inevitability of sophisticated technology must be overcome, and a fresh look must be taken at the need and feasibility aspects of large-scale use of technology for educational purposes. If and when sophisticated technology is acquired by institutions in the developing countries, the use of it must be considered on the basis of its usability and accessibility from the institutional and students' points of view. Once indigenous models take firm roots in the native soils of the developing countries, they would gradually emerge as competitors to the Western models. If the indigenous models fail to take roots, in the era of globalization, educational systems of the developing countries also will soon face the same fate faced by their economic and political institutions. Invisible takeover by the multinational and transnational companies backed by the political superpowers. The above conclusions may sound alarming or even far-fetched to those who have been habituated to looking at educational issues in isolation of economic, political and technological developments. But they are not. Distance education itself has become a global phenomenon, and its developments have intimate relationship with the developments of global trends in economy and technology. Economic imperialism, political imperialism and technological imperialism have simultaneously forged an alliance with cultural imperialism, of which educational imperialism is only a minor component. The dilemma of the developing world is that it has not been able to resist the global onslaught of powerful economies without compromising their own economic interests and political sovereignty. Such compromises are justified by the rulers of the poor nations in the name of integrating themselves with the global economy. In fact, the term globalization is a euphemism for opening the gates of every country to the economically powerful countries. This is not a voluntary welcome, but a compulsion for the weaker nations, without which their very existence as nations would become difficult. The same dilemma, and for the same reasons, is faced by the distance teaching institutions in developing world. It is not a matter of recognition, but a question of resolve that is needed to strengthen the educational models which grow in individual countries, much in the same way one feels the need to protect the seeds and plants of different countries which are threatened and destroyed in their own native soils by the patent rights and GATT agreements signed in Uruguay but decided in Washington. Thank you.